Welcome, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So, we are actually towards the end of the Parsha of Pinchas, and Pinchas, as I've probably mentioned before, is one of the most commonly read Torah portions in the Jewish calendar because the end of Pinchas deals with the various community sacrifices, right? We can divide sacrifices into two basic categories, one being personal offerings and the other being public offerings that are offered on a daily basis and at certain specified times, and that's what we're dealing with in Parshat Pinchas, and we've already started that particular process. We've discussed up to this point the daily Tamid offering offered morning and evening, day and night, no matter what. And then we were dealing with the Shabbat offerings that we're offering on a weekly basis. And this is where we introduce the concept of musaf, which means additional. And there were additional offerings brought on the Shabbat along with the daily offerings. And then we went to the next most frequent, which was the Rosh Chodesh offerings that were brought at the beginning of the month. And now we're going to get into, we also, I believe, discussed Pesach, the offerings of Pesach and Shavuot. And we're going to move now into, and probably also dealt with the Omer, the offering that was brought at the beginning of the Omer period, and as we led into Shavuot. And now, here we go. Uvachodesh Hashvi'i, and then the seventh month, Be'echad lachodesh, on the first day of that month, Mikra Kodesh Yelachem, it shall be a sacred convocation for you, Kol Melechet Avodah, all types of work, Lo Ta'asu, you shall not perform. Yom Tru'ah, it is a day of the blasting of the ram's horn. Lachem would be Yelachem. It shall be a day of blasting the ram's horn. And of course, this is a mitzvah that we still observe even nowadays. Okay. Let me just make sure we cover any Rashis that might be there. So, no, we are good. We are good. Va'asitim olah, and here we go with the actual offerings that are mentioned. Va'asitim olah, you shall perform a whole offering, a burnt offering, l'reach nichoach lashem, as a pleasing savor to the Lord. What are they exactly? Par ben bachar echad, a bull of the herd, one bull of the herd, Ayal Echad, or one ram, Kvasim b'nei shana shiv'ah, going on, Tamimim, seven lambs that are perfect. Please forgive me for the messing around with the text here. And let's see. Okay, so no Rashis on this so far because he's dealt with basically these statements. And this is clearly you'll see that there is repetition because this is a legal section that we're talking about. So each part, each law has to be dealt with on an individual basis. Oh, excuse me. Umin chatam, their meal offerings, solet, fine flour, blulav shemen, mixed with oil, shlosha esrunim lapar, 3/10 of an ephah for a bull, shnei esrunim la'ayil, 2/10 of an ephah for a ram, ve'isaron echad, and 1/10 lakeves echad for each lamb, l'shivat hakavasim, for all seven lambs. So they would have to bring seven going on. U'seir izim echad chatat, and one goat, echad, one chatat, as a sin offering, l'chaper alechem, to atone for you. So earlier on we had read, this is just to review this, that the bull represents Abraham, the ram represents Isaac, The lambs represent Jacob, and the goat of the sin offering represents the goat that the brothers brought to Jacob when they sold Joseph into slavery, and they took his coat of many colors and dipped it in the blood of a goat and showed it to Jacob to try to show him that he'd been killed. So that's why it is a sin offering, because in some ways it summarizes ultimately that when we sin, we are doing something terrible, in this case, against another person. Milvad Olat HaChodesh, this is over and above the Olah, the whole offering brought for the month, Uminchata, and its mincha, its meal offering, V'olata Tamid, and the daily offering, the perpetual offering, Uminchata, and its meal offering, V'niskehem Kemishpatam, and their libations according to their statute, L'reach Nichoch, as a pleasing savor, Ishel Hashem, as a fire offering to the Lord. Please excuse me. So notice that it mentions these additional offerings, all that have to be brought on Rosh Hashanah. And because it says Milvat Olat HaChodesh, it's already mentioned in the previous chapter, the fact that on Rosh Chodesh you had to bring these additional offerings. It says above and over and above the Olah of the new moon. And he says Musafei Rosh Chodesh. This is the additional offerings that were brought on Rosh Chodesh, Shehu B'Yom Rosh Hashanah. Because Rosh Hashanah, that's the holiday that we're referring to right now, is on the first of the month, and so it is at a new moon. So that's why we have to do that. And of course, the daily offerings were brought every single day. That's why it's known as a Tamid. It's a perpetual offering brought every single day. So, going on. So we know it follows Rosh Hashanah. I believe I have already explained how the beginning of the year starts in the seventh month. It's Pesach that occurs in the first month, and that's because the cycle of months is separate from the cycle of years. So this is something that is in other cultures, and in fact, we talk about the academic year that may start in September, as opposed to the new year, which starts on the 1st of January. But so because we're so used to starting the new year on the first month of the year, we do that, but there's no reason why we have to. They are different cycles. Asor lachodesh, and on the 10th day of the month, Hashvi'i, of the seventh of Hazeh, of this seventh month, Mikra Kodesh Yelachem, it shall be a sacred convocation to you. Ve'initem et nafshodechem, and you shall afflict your souls. Kol melacha lo ta'asu, you shall not perform any kind of work. Now here it doesn't say melechet avodah, it says melacha, and so the kinds of work that are forbidden on Yom Kippur, because that's what we're talking about, that occurs on the 10th day of this month, would appear that that's more strict and more like Shabbat, whereas we know that on festivals, certain kinds of things that are forbidden on the Shabbat are permitted, specifically cooking is permitted. It states it explicitly in the Torah that cooking is allowed on Yom Tov. But whether it's allowed on Yom Kippur, maybe we're not so sure because of the wording here. V'hikraftem olah l'Hashem, and you shall bring a whole offering, offer for the Lord, reach nichoch, as a pleasing savor, par ben bakar echad, again, one bull of the herd, ayel echad, one ram, kvasim b'nei shana shiva tmimim, 7 yearling lambs, timimim yulachem, they shall be perfect, they be unblemished, they shall be for you. Uminchatam, and their meal offerings, solet bula bashemen, that is to do with fine flour mixed with oil. Shlosha esronim lapar, we notice the repetition here, right? 3/10 of an ephah for a bull, shnei esronim la'ayla hachad, and 2/10 of an ephah for each ram. Isaron, although it only mentions, let's see, we only are talking about ayal echad, but regardless, again, this is legal material here. Isaron, a 1/10 of an ephah, la keves ha'achad for each lamb, l'shivat ha'kasim for all 7 lambs. Se'ir izim echad chatat, a one goat, right? Chatat as a sin offering, milvad chatat ha'kipurim, aside from, excuse me, I have 3 that's going on here. So kinds of interesting things that happen while I'm trying uh, to record this. And of course, I think the word Seir was understood by my phone as Siri. But anyway, as a sin offering, milvad chatat ha'kipurim, over and above the sin offering of atonement for olat tamid and the perpetual offering, the whole offering of the Tamid, uminchata, and its you shall perform these, its meal offering, v'niskahem, and their libations. So what's this chatat haKippurim? What's the sin offering of atonement? Rashi explains, milvad chatat haKippurim. He says, se'ir hane'esa bifnim. There was a goat whose blood was sprinkled in the inner sanctuary, we know, into the Holy of Holies. Amur be'acharemot. It's mentioned in Parshat Acharemot in the book of Leviticus. That is where we read about the actual ritual of Yom Kippur, shegam hu chatat, because it also was a sin offering. So that is mentioned in that regard for Olata Tamid and the Tamid offering, Umilvad Olata Tamid. So it says and the meal offering, but it says over and above the meal offering, Tasu Ulot Halalu, you shall do these particular offerings. You shall perform these whole offerings, these olot, etc. V'niskehem, and their libations, musav halamusafim, that is attached also to the musafim, these additional offerings, aktuvim, that were written down, that were mentioned, ve'al ta'asu, and it's on this idea of ta'asu. Now, you shall, even though this word, I did look for this word ta'asu, and it's not there in the text here, but we understand that here, where it talks about performing these, vahu lashon, yet it is an expression of tzivui. It's actually a command. Here it is a command of them to perform these particular uh, meal offerings and libations, right? So, milvat olat tamid. Along with or over and above the perpetual offering, the perpetual olah, the daily tamid, uminchata, and its meal offering, tasu et elu v'niskehem, you should perform these with their libations. So not just the tamid, but all these other things, all these additional ones, it's a command to do these. וכן כל ונזקיהם האמורים בכל מועדות, excuse me. And likewise, wherever it mentions these libations, referring with regard to all the moadim are the festivals, right? The appointments we have with God, chutz mishel korbanot hachag or hechag. It doesn't. The ones that we mentioned are commands, but the ones that are mentioned with regards to the offerings brought on Sukkot, which we will come into in just a moment, shekol v'niska v'niskehem v'nismunscha'echeha, because in mentioning those 7 days of Sukkot, right, at the end of it, it talks about its offering, its libation, excuse me, their libation and her libation, Shebahem Musavim al Hatamid, right? That are also connected with the Tamid, ve'enan lashon tzivui. But in their connection, they are not mentioned there, even though they're again it's connected to the whole Tamid, the perpetual offering. They are not, however, an expression of a command. They're not. Sha'arei niskehem shel musafim tuvim la'atzman b'chol yom b'yom. Because okay, so I think what Rashi is trying to say here is that when it mentions the meal offerings and their libations, it is mentioning it in respect to the fact that we know that this is mentioned with regard to the Tamid, the daily offering. And so this is in addition to the daily offerings, that these libations and meal offerings have to be brought in addition to the daily offerings. And that's the point that is being made in the grammar here, so to speak. But with regard to the various days of Sukkot, where it mentions these libations, right? They are there simply saying they are brought, it's not they should be brought, etc. Because each day we'll see they are mentioned. And again, the idea that in saying that they're associated with the Tamid, with the perpetual sacrifice, that's where the idea of the offering, the daily offering and its libations, etc., is a command. And here it is simply a description. Well, we'll see more about this later. Going on. So let's keep going. I want to make sure I did the last part here in the Rashi, right? That was back in verse 11. So we need to go back here to verse 12. And now we get to Sukkot, right? That is on the 15th day of Lachodesh Hashvi'i, of the 7th month, Mikra Kodesh Yelachem. It shall be a sacred occasion to you, sacred convocation. Kol Melechet Avodah Lo Tasu. And there it talks about Si Melechet Avodah. There it talks about any kind of Melechet Avodah, work you shall not perform. V'chagotim chag ladonai shivat yamim, and you shall celebrate, right, a festival to the Lord for 7 days. Now, this word chag actually has to do with circle. The word chug has to do with the word circle, and it connotes the idea of the hakafot, right, where we walk around the synagogue, in a procession, and that is a remembrance of how they would march around the altar in a procession, that there was religious and spiritual significance in marching around the altar, encircling the altar and marching around it. And I'm trying to think in my mind, the symbolism involved. I think in some ways there is a way of honoring and celebrating this. I actually remember, this is a wonderful memory I have, that when my grandson had his bris and we had it in the synagogue, I remember I invited the rabbis to come and bless him, and they actually danced around him, and it was very touching to see them doing that. So just, that idea of honoring in this particular kind of way. V'ikravtem olah isherech nichoach ladonai, and you shall offer up a olah, right, that whole offering, isher, a fire offering, reach nichoach, of pleasing savor, lashem, to the Lord, parim b'nei bakar sha'asar, so 13 bulls of the herd, elim shnayim, 2 rams, kvasim b'nei shana, lambs, yearling lambs, arba'asar, 14. And look at the tremendous numbers of offerings that are brought here. Tmimim yihu, they shall be perfect. So the tremendous amount of offerings brought on Sukkot as a feast and a celebration before God. So I want to comment a little bit, and I'm pretty sure I've done this in previous lessons, this idea of pleasing savor. And I think the idea is that in performing these particular offerings, in bringing these offerings, and the willingness to bring such offerings, the very fact that they are being performed is something that we're using language to denote the joy that God has, even though, of course, we can't really make such descriptions. But the idea that in performing these mitzvot, these particular commandments, they are a special, they have a special a role to play, and I think that's precisely because if you look at how people tend to look at bringing sacrifices, they tend to look at put it down, and not want to do it. And so this is the very fact that people are willing to do what doesn't come naturally is something that is particularly appreciated. Well, minchatam, their meal offerings, solid bulav hashemen, just the shaman. Notice again the repetition, right? And their meal offerings, fine flour, solid is fine flour, bulav hashemen, mixed with oil. Shosha isronim pala, as we've come to expect, 3/10 of an ephah for a bull, ha'echad for each bull, lo shlosha asar parim for each one of the 13 rams, shnei isronim la'ayil, 2/10 for each ram, ha'echad for each ram, lishnei ha'alim for the 2 rams, v'isaron, isaron, lakeves ha'echad, and 1/10, a tenth of of an ephah for each lamb, la'arba'a sakvasim for the 14 lambs, u'seir izim echad chatat, and one, excuse me, and one goat as a sin offering, milvad olat tamid, apart from the perpetual offering, minchata veniska, its meal offering and its libations. So here is where he's saying the idea of how here it talks about the meal offering and its libations in connection with the Tamid, and how in saying it here it refers back to all these others as well. Okay, I believe, but let me think about that carefully. And it could be, actually, that that is the point that Rashi was making, is that the minchata v'niska here is not a commandment, it is a description. And the idea of bringing meal offerings and their libations mentioned in regard to the Tamid applies again to these other offerings as well. And this was the point that Rashi was making. I confess that this is a little bit difficult to understand exactly the point that Rashi was making. Bayom Hasheni, on the second day of this 7-day feast, right? Parim b'nei bakar shnei masar. So look at this. We now have bulls of the herd 12. Elim shnaim. Once again, we have 2 rams, but notice that we reduced the number of bulls on the second day. Kvasim b'nei shana arba asar tmimim, but we still have 14 yearling lambs as well, right? Uminchatam, and their meal offerings, Veniskehem, and their okay, so this is, I'm sorry, this is what he's talking about. That's where it says minchata. So this is what Rashi, this is becoming clear now, that here where it's talking umiskatam v'niskehem, and that's what he's talking about when he says here, right, that that here, right, minchatam, etc., that here, I'm making sure that that here it's this part which is simply description and isn't a commandment. So I'm going to say that ulat hatamid minchata beniska, I would think, okay, has to do with the point that Rashi was making before, how he notes this distinction. So So going on, I'm just making sure, I want to make sure that we have, yes, right. So this here is not a commandment, it's a description. So you can see I was bothered by what Rashi was saying here and trying to understand the point that he was making. So I think I have a better idea, and hopefully for you to, I've conveyed that to you as well. So the meal offerings and the libations, la parim, la elim, la kvasim, for the bulls, for the rams, and for the lambs. Going on, right? But misparam, according to the number, kamishpat, according to the laws regarding those. Osirizim chad chatat, and one lamb as a sin offering, milvad olat tamid, apart from the tamid offering, umin chata, and its mincha, v'niskehem, and their libations. So now I'm back to, again, having to think about what was Rashi saying when he was talking about the one case being in a command and one case it being simply a description. I confess that I am still not entirely satisfied that I fully understand that. So let's take a look here. This is verse 18 here. It says, Umin chatam beniskehem laparim, right? It says the meal offering and the libations for the bulls. And of course, it goes on to say the rams and the lambs. So he says, this is in Tractate Sukkah of the Talmud, page 57. Parei hachag ayamhem. That if you count up all the bulls brought, right, starting with 13, 12, etc., all the 7 days, you get a total of 70, right? He says ayamhem. They are 70 in number. So what's the significance of the 70 in number? Keneged shiv'im umot uvdei gilulim. That is to correspond to the 70 idolatrous nations. Shemit ma'atim v'holchim, that are going to be reduced. The fact that these are reduced every day is the idea of idolatry slowly being swept away. That the nations that perform idolatry will slowly come to an end. Siman Kliya, it is an indication of Kliya means the ending of them, right? He, lahem, for them, uvimei hamikdash, and during the days when the temple still existed, hayu maginim alehem min hayisurim. It would protect them from the Yisurim. So who's the them here? I wonder if it is actually referring to these other nations that because they were bringing these up, I mean, one could, it's ambiguous and it's not clear. Who's the Haim? Who's the them here? Is it the idolatrous nations or is it the Jewish people? Is it the Israelites? Because certainly perhaps on a more obvious level, you might say it refers to the Israelites who were bringing these offerings, or whether or not it was saying that this was going to happen, and whether or not it was also there to protect the people, individuals in these nations. Again, as I think this through, it is not clear. So there are elements here that I have to think through and see what it's speaking about. Because since the Israelites are the ones who are bringing these offerings, it would seem clearer that it's referring to them as the Israelites. But who knows? Who knows? I'll just keep going here just to finish this off, and we'll finish for today. Belakvasim, right, and for the lambs, Keneged Israel. So here, these 14 lambs, right, that were brought every day, they symbolize Israel. Shinikra'u, how do we know this? In Jeremiah chapter 50, it says, Sep Zurah. It refers to the Israelites as being a scattered lambs that have been scattered. Vahem Kvuim, but we notice that they are set, right, 14 every day. Set uminyanam tishim, and if you count up how many there are brought, 14 on 7 days, we get to a total of, as you probably figured out the math already, Tish'im Ushmuna, right? We have yeah, I want to make sure I'm reading all the Rashi here, right? Right. The total number is Tish'im 98, Shmuna. Lechalot mehem, to remove from them, tishim v'shmona klalot, the idea of bringing these 98 lambs was to remove and to annul the 98 klalot curses shebishne Torah that are mentioned in Deuteronomy, right? In Parshat Kitavo, there's the blessings and the curses there mentioned, and there are apparently 98 curses. Basheni Ne'amar, on the second day, it mentions Veniskehem, it says, and their libations, not Veniska, right? Al Shnei Tamidei Hayom, there it's regarding, right, the two Tamid, the lamb that was born in the morning, the lamb that was born in the evening on the second day. Velo, and there, going on, lo shina halashon, and there it did not, and we notice that the expression in the Hebrew is different, right? It doesn't say niska, it says niskehem, and the only reason it changed the way in which it expressed it, elon lidrosh, it was to give us reason to interpret this. Kamosha Amru Razal, and the interpretation is as our sages of blessed memory mention in the Tractate Shabbat, page 103, page 2. B'shani v'niskehem, on the second day it says v'niskehem. B'shishi, on the sixth day of Sukkot, it talks about unsacheha, right? And it's again, and her libations. B'shvi'i, and it says b'mishpatam. In other words, there are slight changes, and we notice, right, that it says niskehem, so there's the mem there. And then it says unsacheha, that's this yud here, and mishpatam, this additional mem. So we have these mem, yud, mem, hare kan mayim. So that spells mayim, water. Remez, and this is an allusion, the nisuch hamayim, to the water libation mina Torah b'chag, that this water libation that took place on Sukkot is actually alluded to in the Torah itself. There was this simchat, I believe he's referring to what was called simchat Beit HaShoeva. This was the celebration of the waters, right, of the place of waters, etc., that took place or drawing water. Lishov means to draw water, that took place in the temple. So we will continue this at our next meeting. Just want to find the place here. So we had the Rashi was taken care of over several. So verse 18 was the last verse we did. So we'll continue now next time with verse 19. So I'll mark the place here with verse 19. And I'll stop the share. So we do that. Any comments on what we're doing? I apologize for the lack of clarity on my side. It's also for me a work in progress.
No, as a practical matter, your translation pretty much parallels what I'm seeing in the art scroll.
Okay.
It's not the easiest thing to follow, and there are numerous notes below the Rashi translation trying to explain it. I think so. You're doing fine.
Well, thank you for the encouragement. It matters.
All right. Okay.
Thank you. Okay, I'll stop the recording. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry, Harlan. What were you going to say?
I was just so confused about the animals, the number of animals for each, for purification, for Thanksgiving, and the number of animals for each, for the sin, different animals for different things. I can't figure that out.
Okay. So essentially, the animals brought on the festivals, right? Or were all lot. They were all whole offerings. And so that they were public. They were brought on behalf of the entire Jewish people at these specific times. My sense about the festivals, this is something that a conclusion I reached many, many years ago, is that the reason why these days are stipulated as festivals is because they were days in which the divine presence manifested itself in the world in an unusual kind of way. You think of Pesach and how the angel of death killed the firstborn. You think about the seventh day of Pesach, which is the crossing of the Red Sea, these miracles, Shavuot, when the Torah was given, right? Um, Rosh Hashanah has to do with the creation of the world, right? So again, that this world is actually a manifestation of the divine. Yom Kippur is the day in which the sins of the Jewish people for worshiping the golden calf were forgiven. Okay. And Sukkot, according to while there's no specific day that Sukkot is associated with, it nevertheless is associated with the miracles involved in the wandering on the desert when they were, in the wilderness, the years between Egypt and getting into the land of Israel. That's part of it. Part of it has to do with the idea that there being sufficient water for people to survive because we need water in order for the vegetation. I mean, water is a basic necessity for civilization and for human endurance, that these are all, we should recognize them as being of divine origin. So that's why I think these offerings were brought up, because in this particular case, I think these offerings were a sense of thanksgiving and acknowledgement. And then when it comes to the goat, that is specifically mentioned as a sin offering. And as I mentioned before, that is to balance out what the brothers did to Joseph as a remembrance of these things. So I don't know if that's helpful, Harlan, but I hope it is.
Uh, that is helpful. They sent a goat out to, uh, I
Okay,
don't
that is Yom
remember this.
Kippur. That is Yom Kippur. That is
Yeah, why would they send
that's a
that goat
separate
out?
goat. Okay, so
All the sins were put on the goat?
yes, okay. So that is a topic which I'm not going to entertain right now, Harlan, but we can try and do it at another point. Okay,
Okay.
but that is an acharemot. That's back in Leviticus where we discuss the idea of the scapegoat. All right. So
Yeah.
yeah, but it wouldn't be part of what we're dealing with now.
But with all the like the purification,
Mhm.
Thanksgiving, and so forth,
Mhm. Yeah.
each have different uh, animals for their each you know uh, each a pure. If you're going to have a purification, you have to have so many animals. If you have
Okay, I
uh,
see what you're saying. Again, here you're talking about a situation where there are individual sacrifices that you brought
yeah,
for personal purification. So
yeah,
that is again not the topic. I'm going to not deal with it because that is not the topic we're dealing with right now. We're dealing with public offerings. I mean, you're absolutely right that they are mentioned in regard to personal offerings and as part of the purification offering. Understand that in general, I'll try to at least answer it on this particular level. There are ways in which we're saying that our lives are so much in the hands of the divine that when we commit sins, when we act in impure ways, right, that in a way our lives are in the balance. That if
oh
God wanted to take our life at that moment, since God is the author of our existence, and if we're doing things to insult and to in a sense act in a criminal way against our Creator, our lives become, you know,
yeah,
so
but we don't own
taking
our body. We rent it. He owns
well,
our
even the
body.
more so. So if you abuse it, even that's an even bigger argument to say that you have to do something to atone for what you just did. And
I've
then
got to
rather
get
than,
going.
I know, I understand, but
Yeah.
rather than have to do it yourself, with your own life, you can do it with an animal. And with that, I'm going to stop the recording.